I do various things, but given I'm in Newcastle, one of my jobs is I'm the founder of Renew Newcastle and work part-time for Renew Newcastle. I also work with Renew Australia, that works with other communities doing creative empty space activation type projects. I'm a writer and I'm currently a television presenter as well, so many hats, but it changes from week to week. I think what I've always done is organise my creative community, whatever that is in some way, into sort of outcomes, events, festivals, and the scale of that and the nature of that has changed probably over the last couple of decades, I guess it is now. Renew Newcastle would not have happened if it wasn't for social media. Like just a couple of years before would have been. We would not have, I don't think we would have got the critical mass to demonstrate the idea works. The first thing I did when starting Renew Newcastle was start a Facebook group. And the fact that that Facebook group had 3,500 members within a few weeks made me realise that this wasn't a stupid idea. And I think if I'd been sort of operating in isolation, I would have, I probably wouldn't, it was even just the catch-22, I'd raised the expectations of a whole bunch of people, so I had to keep going, So Renew Newcastle's now done 180-ish projects and 70 properties, but there's another 50 or so around the country that have been opened up under the model that we've used, people in local communities doing similar things. But it's not as simple as just going to every community and just going, here's the stuff, go and do it. I actually thought it would be, to be honest. And I think I underestimated the need for, a lot of it's based on quite complex relationships and nuances that people, it's about having the right champions in the local community, that sort of stuff, which I think I'd probably underestimated that aspect of it. We live in a world of kind of networked experiments where lots of people are trying and doing lots of things, and we now live in an age where those experiments inform each other really quickly. Growing up here, I felt like I was on time delay to the rest of the world. It was you'd get magazines and they'd be 3 months out of date, Nowadays, if you do something here, someone, I can post a link to a new Renew Newcastle space opening, and someone who's got a similar project on the other side of the world can see that via my Twitter feed and start contacting that person. And so you're seeing these kind of cross-pollinations and things happening in every direction. And I find that really interesting. I find being part of that really interesting, and I both contribute to and draw on that big body of sort of knowledge and cross-pollinating experiments, and I think that's really fascinating. Renew is an exercise in essentially taking a bunch of dysfunctional systems and trying to insert a functional layer into them, realising that everyone, it literally began with an experience of me trying to start a small bar, about 5 or 6 years ago, realising that real estate agents weren't returning my phone calls, and basically that, it sort of was 20 years of experience to realise they didn't take people like me very seriously. It's individually rational for 150 property owners to leave their properties empty right now, but it's collectively insane because they are all collectively driving down the value of the properties that they're working with. So how, that's a function of a set of problems in a system, and so what I was trying to do with Renew was okay, so how do you get into the nuts and bolts of that system and actually change it? And that's about introducing different, just different models, different layers of contracts, different layers of umbrella insurance and legal contracts and all sorts of things that we put in place. It's establishing relationships where the incentives are different than what they would be in a normal commercial relationship, so people have reasons to work with each other. And in some ways that's the most, the sort of intellectual exercise of unpacking that is actually one of the things I found most interesting. And then from there you run the experiment and see whether the experiment works, and it seems to have worked. Culturally, I just think, how you support, how you grow value out of, how you enable, for lack of a better word, that creative space to flourish and grow. We've seen Renew Newcastle projects grow from one person in their bedroom to employing 9 or 10 people, and how do you create environments that are conducive for those things to grow? And I think technology is doing that at one end. My interest recently has been how cities and communities do that at the practical other end, so how do you get spaces and places to take advantage of what this potential is unleashing. And that continues to interest me, but I don't know where I'll go next with that. I don't know. I might just take 2 months off and then have another crazy idea and start something else. It's kind of interesting way, because sometimes I feel very illegitimate. Like, I actually feel like I don't actually do anything. You know, like at the end of the day, that, like, you know, everything I've ever done is just getting other people to do stuff they wanted to do anyway, and just hanging around and getting credit for it. You know, like, it's actually quite, it's almost like, you know, it's almost disingenuous. You know, it's like, it's not, I don't know. I genuinely feel that sometimes. Like, it's like, you know, like, okay, so all these shops have opened in Newcastle. I didn't open any of them, you know, like I just set up a thing so that all these other people actually did the work, you know. My view is that ideas are best shared. Like, I'm not territorial about my ideas at all. I've got so many, you know, it would relieve a burden on me if someone else would do some of them for a while, you know. Yeah, well, I sometimes like to say that I've made every mistake you can possibly make at least once. The only thing I'm good at is not repeating my mistakes. So, you know, like, I've done a lot of projects over a lot of years, and they, to varying degrees, they've always become more complicated, but, you know, I basically learnt by doing. My great skill is not in actually spending large amounts of money on great events, it's actually on trying to pull together things on no money, you know. So, like, Renew Newcastle was seed funded on my credit card. Like, I just paid for it. I made 40 trips to Newcastle before I got paid. Like, literally 40 trips, like, you know, from Melbourne. It was like nuts. It was absolutely stupid. But if I'd waited for the funding, it'd never have happened. Like, you know, like, I can't. It wasn't an option. Like, I was in discussions about funding with the council and state government or whatever, but their time cycles are so slow, and I was trying to catch a moment where, you know, there was a period of initiative and momentum, and I wanted to, like, letting that go was much worse than not having any money. Like, that's another one of my really strong beliefs. I believe that initiative and momentum are real forces in the world. Most of the things I've done, I've started without any external. So Octopod was literally seed funded by 6 of us, I think, going in and taking dole loans. And we put all the money into, like, it meant we had to go in and lie to the Department of Social Security to say that we needed $500 for a job-related purpose. I still remember that phrase, job-related purpose. And 6 or 8 of us, whatever it is, all went in and did that in the same week and pulled all the money into $3,000 or whatever it was, which gave us enough capital to start that organisation. And, like, I ran the first Newcastle Fringe Festival, and did the whole event, and there was, you know, 40 events, and I can't remember how many artists or whatever involved, and all that sort of stuff. And at the end of it, someone said, "Where'd you get the funding from?" And I went, "Funding? What do you mean?" And I said, like the government. Like, what, they give money for this stuff? Like, I didn't know, right? I genuinely didn't know. And so, there are a lot of things I've done, ultimately, they have become sustainable because they have been, you can't sustain them forever on momentum and initiative and passion alone. But I've also philosophically, practically been of the view that you do it and demonstrate the value of it, not try and, you know, argue it into being or you know, like, wait for the money, you know. And I think, you know, it's been, part of the pattern in my life is actually often the case that I end up starting lots of things that actually pay someone else when I leave. Like, you know, like, it's just the reality. Like, you know, Octopod, I can't remember how long I was involved in, but Octopod's got paid staff now. I was never one of them, you know. Similarly, Renew Newcastle, the whole point was to get enough money into the organisation so I didn't have to keep coming back all the time. You know, and that meant creating a job for someone else, you know. And that's not to say that, you know, Marnie, who initially had that job, and Christopher's got now, they're, you know, like, they're absolutely vital to the organisation. But that it's an interest, like, but, you know, like, that's part of that's just recognising what my particular skill set and interest is, which is starting things. And I think starting things is actually really hard to get funding. Like, you know, like, and that's been one of my ongoing criticisms of the funding system, is that it pulls around institutions and organisations that already have resources and doesn't invest in possibilities or things that aren't, you know, it's not open to experimentation. So again, that goes back to the sort of the model of Renew, recognising that in order to get experimentation to happen, it's not going to happen through a funding-driven model. It's got to happen through some other resource being the driver. And then in that case, in Newcastle's case, it's space. It's just that space is available. So Renew has ultimately, you know, I think about sort of 6 or 8 months into it, we got some money from the state government, we got a little bit of money from Newcastle Now to pay for some of the insurance, and we got some money from eventually the council. And so but to this day, those are the three main funding sources for Renew Newcastle. It would not be sustainable without funding. It would die without funding because it's just too complex an organisation to rely on volunteers. But if I'd waited for funding, it would never have started.